Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 804, May the 4th, 1987. Our would-be king and queen are falling apart in front of our eyes in the White House. He has much further to fall than any president of the United States. Ronald Reagan was put together by J. Walter Thompson and the Hollywood studios that made the movies that told you to go to war, to go off to war. It's hard to hold that kind of image together forever. Reagan's so far out of contact with reality that the front page of the newspapers across the country today quoted him as saying that he wanted to return democracy to Nicaragua. When did Nicaragua have democracy after the Spanish discovered it and after the Americans got there? Reagan sincerely believes that the Shahs of Iran or the Savak or the Somoza army are the democracies of Iran and Nicaragua, and when he works to put in the democracies, he can't separate fascism from democracy. The fate of the king and queen in our United States, the would-be king and queen, came apart with exposures of Alfred Bloomingdale, that is a gentleman that Reagan put on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and he and Betsy were two of the president and his wife's closest friends. The social life in Washington was pretty high fashion with a lot of borrowed jewelry and beaded dresses. And then all of a sudden we learned about the kinky sex, the sadomasochism, the group sex, the chains, the whips, the mistresses. And some of this is allegedly on videotapes. And after that point, the Reagans went off to Camp David every Friday and returned on Sunday. And that about ended their social life. They've somewhat been in seclusion except for a few state dinners, and they're not very often. Alfred Bloomingdale, at the time all of this was going on, of course, was in a position appointed by the president to the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. One of the members of that board was Roy Cohn. He was also on the board of Western Goals and the first person from the administration to die of AIDS. Bloomingdale's mistress, Vicky Morgan, lived with him, and at the same time she shared a home with Bernie Cornfeld. And Bernie Cornfeld's investment overseas and his partner to Robert Vesco set up the banking network by which the Iran-Contra gate people got involved, and I'll go into that a little more of that in a moment. So Bloomingdale was tied in early to these banking schemes, and through his joint mistress with Cornfeld and the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board has used these offshore banking teams that they inherited from the administration before and the one before, but Reagan took it to the ultimate. The saddest thing about Reagan's life is all this comes down and the gavel goes down tomorrow on the hearings that begin the hearings was the sad story of his son, Michael, telling about being molested for 1 year by a scout advisor and coming forward at this time. Their life is, I'm sure, a personal tragedy, all of them. And the tragedy that's the worst of all is, first of all, pretending, and the second of all, imposing the mentality that they had, which was cruel and vindictive and not able to see what other people feel or think. And Reagan never changed. He had that same attitude in California, and the same for the corporations he worked for, like General Electric and so forth. There is an author, a professor, who I've read at various times, Herbert Mueller, and his subject that he particularly has studied is freedom. And he's interested, he's written a book, Freedom in the Modern World, Freedom from Religion or with Religion, Freedom in the Western World, the issues of freedom, the loom of history, the spirit of tragedy, the uses of the past. Those are titles of his books on how do you stay free. And we were almost losing a lot of our collective freedom under this administration, as other countries have, as Reagan planned 60 covert operations to overthrow 60 different countries, and we don't have to enumerate them now to see the things that he's done. But in this book, Herbert Miller talks about the Versailles Treaty and the sad death, the demise of Woodrow Wilson. And there's a similarity in this book to the tragedies that are taking place now with Irangate, and I just want to share a few sentences. He said there was little question about the moral grandeur of Woodrow Wilson. He said he was the only leading statesman at Paris who was disinterested and unselfish. He wasn't seeking anything for his own nation. He was devoted wholly to the cause of world peace, and he was the only one whose failure may be called a great failure because of the inability to hold the peace. The hardest working of the statesmen, too, of all the statesmen, he had always constantly to be assailed by national greed and hatred. And this author tells how Wilson had a lot of faults, and he enumerates them, but he also had the vision of hope, and he did hope that something like the League of Nations, he said, was the only hope of mankind. It may be frail. There's no other way to assure the peace. And he said, I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war if the nations of the world do not concert the methods by which to prevent it. He said that America again will be fighting, fighting Germany on the same battlegrounds, which they did with the same allies. And the conclusion of this author about Wilson's era, going to the next one, he said, at the end, Wilson attacked the idea of the disenchanted that he had to deal with. He said and believed the world is run by ideals, and only the fools think otherwise, that ideals are really the most important thing to live by. And then after Wilson died, Mr. Mueller continues, by the time the fools had taken over America, with the aid of shoddier ideals, the Republican bosses picked out Senator Harding to serve as their front in taking over government. A folksy, small-town non-entity, which is like Reagan, comfortably ignorant of the world, always at home with platitudes, Harding was an ideal puppet. He demanded nothing of the people, assuring them that the present need was not heroics but healing, promising a return to normalcy, whatever that is, the good old days of business as usual, and the voters responded by giving him an overwhelming popular majority. By general consent, the worst president of the country has ever had, he was presumably just the kind of man that they deserved. In any case, he inaugurated the most inglorious decade in the nation's history. Now, we see this happening with Ronald Reagan coming in as president, and he is inaugurating, or has inaugurated, the most horrible era of American history that we'll have to undo for years to come. As a matter of fact, there was an article in the LA Times. It's written by James Michener, who's a staunch Republican and was gung-ho for Reagan all the way. The article is titled, You Can Call the 1980s the Ugly Decade, the Ugliest Decade. And he was part of the system who went for the platitudes, who went for this non-entity, who agreed to put him in that all we need is healing. What was the healing? The murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, John Lennon, Frank Church, Senator Philip Hart, Olof Palme, Ralph Bunche, Dag Hammarskjöld, Salvador Allende, Mr. Bhutto in Pakistan, Maurice Bishop in Grenada. Reagan knocked him off and wanted to kill Gaddafi. Kent State, all of these preceded, and in comes Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and they are going to do away with the ideals. They're pragmatic. They know how to deal, mixing the Vatican, the Moonies, the Mafia, the secret teams, the National Security Council, the Brzezinskis, the Kissingers. They're going to do it all themselves. They're going to make the world the way they want it, and Congress is supposed to sit by and take it. Ideals die hard, or do they die at all? And was Woodrow Wilson correct when he said the world is run by ideals? The answer to that question isn't in yet. I don't have the answer, but however, we do have the pleasure of observing, starting tomorrow, May the 5th, 1987, some of the sleaziest, the cruelest, the most corrupt manipulators of human history. They will be exposed in some fashion, not totally, but in some fashion, and most will get pardons. All will become millionaires. Books, movies, so what? It doesn't matter what their rewards are. Watergate became a word, a meaning. Iran, Contra, Gate, however you want to term this, it's Reagan's turn to do the things he always dreamed of doing, which were manipulation. That was his dream. And now he has to see those pieces shattered like broken glass, and they've been coming apart since last October. There's high drama in the nation this week. The high drama is going around the world. The hearings start, and this whole thing begins to, not all of it, but pieces get unglued publicly with the massive television, videotapes, before Senate Select Committees. They're going to locate and identify some of the methods by which Ronald Reagan circumvented Congress, the official Defense Department, the Secretary of State. He passed up existing agencies that were provided to safeguard our liberties. Reagan wasn't the first person to do this. He wasn't the first person to use the National Security Council like that. I think that you can thank Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger for turning that agency into what it became, and certainly after World War II, when it was formed in 1947. But we are going on to the next chapter of history, not to the past, and he was caught, and therefore he must, in effect, stand trial, and that's what these hearings are about. This is Reagan's private army, who will be given certain rewards to tell how Reagan operated, and don't believe for a minute that he wasn't a hand-on president and didn't know every single thing he did. He couldn't have run California like that for 8 years and then lost the ability to hold it together, because he's the same man he was in Washington that he was in California. Now, it's seldom in one's lifetime, and I'm talking about myself and other researchers in particular, that we are lucky enough to see these things unfold before our eyes. And I mentioned this before, but not only our eyes, things that we've seen for eyes only are on that wide screen now tape for history. For 24 years, I've researched murders and criminals in Washington, and starting May 17th of this year, it'll be my 17th year on the air. June 17th, I believe it was, when the Pentagon Papers broke. Now, congressional hearings such as this never uncover the whole truth. At the end of the Watergate hearings, I published within that year the Senate Select Committee as part of the cover-up. But it gave you a good enough view to have building blocks to understand why this is happening now, and that's the main thing. Raw nerves are exposed, connecting tissues are open. It's hard to put them back. Like John Ehrlichman said, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And along these lines of being an investigator and being able to see these things unfold in front of me, as well as my coworkers, and I do believe in synchronicity. I got a package this week that made me very happy and made me realize that these 23 years of research and 16 years on the air, I know they have a value, but it isn't always, again, in your lifetime that you can get your peer group to understand what you're doing. And this week I got a book from George Seldes. It's an autographed book. His most recent book, George Seldes, is now 97 years old. It's called A Witness to History, Encounters with the Noted, the Notorious, and the Three SOBs, published by Ballantine. And I want to share with you what he wrote inside the book and what I wrote back to him and with the people who sent this to me, because it's pertinent that George Seldes was exposing these very people, the DuPonts, the Morgans, the Mellons, the causes that would become World War II. He had a newsletter, a small newsletter called In Fact, and I have all 4 volumes bound together. But he was doing something, very heroic for his time, and still is, naming the people that were causing so much pain and hardship on people who were to die, to be tortured, to be moved around as immigrants, and he was trying to expose what was happening. And fortunately, he has lived through this whole cycle. I haven't been doing it as long as he has, but he has lived to see how these kings do fall and how their mischief really tangles the whole world, and every time they get into a ball of wax, it brings in more people until we have real crises in this country and around the world. Now, in the book, front page, he autographed it to Mae Brussell, the American Apassionaria. This gift from Lud Ahrens. Lud Ahrens is a fellow researcher and a mutual friend of George Seldes, who went and took a picture of Seldes autographing the book and sent me the book, and he said, "This is from the Society of Journalists, also best wishes, George Seldes, April 26, 1987. And the front page of the book is open, and Lud Ahrens took a picture of him signing it to Mae Brussell. And this was one of the happiest treasures I have received in the 23 years of research. And with it came a letter from the Society of Journalists, signed by Michael Conway, a friend and associate of George Seldes, sending the book and writing to me. And he said, "Dear Mae Brussell, the Awards Committee of the Society of Journalists takes great pleasure of informing you that you have been voted the winner of the George Seldes Award for Relevant Journalism for 1987 for work that you accomplished in 1986. In addition, the committee wishes to cite you for your consistent devotion to reporting the hard stories that have been neglected by so many others. Your unflinching courage, determination, and single-minded dedication to your purpose of airing the most vital news necessary to create a more rational society is also recognized and lauded by the Society. This letter has been typed on George Seldes' 1937 Royal, which has typed many of his most noted manuscripts. Congratulations and many good wishes to continue your most crucial work. And I answered back and said, Dear George, your autographed book, Witness to a Century, and the picture Led Ahrens took of you arrived yesterday. I can't think of anything that has happened to me in 23 years research, doing 16 years on the air, that has made me more proud and happy. You are the master genius whose examples of honesty, disgust of fascism, inspires people like me to do our work. I took a picture of my special place where I keep your books and will send it to you when the roll is developed. My collection includes, and these are the books that I have that he's written, You Can't Print That, Can These Things Be, Sawdust Caesar, Lords of the Press, The Catholic Crisis, Facts and Fascism, 1,000 Americans, The People Don't Know, Tell the Truth and Run, Never Tire Protesting, In Fact, Great Thoughts, Even the Gods Can't Change History, and in fact I have 4 volumes of his newsletter, 1945 to 1950. I concluded, what can I say to you except thank you very, very much. I'm dedicated to my research, and I know the information is valuable and important. However, it isn't very often that someone so courageous as you, who has consistently known the enemy and identified them, is able to come forward as you did to hopefully inspire me for as many years as you have enjoyed. My 65th birthday is this month. Did you feel like 40 when you were 65? And he's 97 now. Maybe the amount of years doesn't matter when you're doing the right thing. It agreed with you, and it certainly does with me. Please thank Michael Conway and Led Ahrens for their wonderful letter and book and photographs of you. These will be framed on my wall. And in conjunction with the Contra Gate hearings coming down and proceeding tomorrow, I talked with Don Fried this morning. Don Fried wrote a brilliant book on Ronald Reagan called The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan. It was published in 1984, immediately locked up and suppressed. But Don's books and his plays are identical to George Seldes. His life is a testament to continuous struggle to expose fascism, twisted minds that torture and kill, and expose high authorities who employ killers to do their work. It was Don Fried who set up the press conference at LA Press Club for me when I came out with my article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, that detailed all the connecting links, the major connecting links at the time of Watergate, and it was printed in the Realist in 1972, in the summer of 72. We both agreed on the telephone we'd hold a drink, although I don't drink hard stuff, and we'd toast the people we know and that we appreciate, who were never fooled by the likes of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. You know, there'll be approximately 200 books on Reagan, but this was a lonely fight for a long, long time. The books will flow now, and they'll go to the computers and they'll look up his past and every rotten thing about him, and yet the authors will not admit that most of them were part of the problem because they refused to expose Ronald Reagan when he announced he was going to be president of the United States, or wanted to be. There were several other people that had worked continuously on these deep roots of fascism that Reagan was galloping towards. One who's done a monumental job is Peter Dale Scott in Berkeley. He's worked on the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, the drug connections, and now he's writing a book with Jonathan Marshall on the Iran-Contra links going back to the 70s. And Jonathan Marshall has gotten out a newsletter, Parapolitics, identifying many of the people involved in working with this Contra-Iran scandal years before it became known as that, and the official day for world awareness is tomorrow. But these people have done a lot of quiet work, and they've written and shared their work with the public. And also David Emery up at KFJC in Nip Tuck. Dave puts on Radio Free America and One Step Beyond, 3 hours a week, almost for 7 years, and they play World Watchers up there on KKUP, KFJC, each station twice a week. And that is the thing that keeps the information flowing out there so people understand these things even before it is officially recognized that they get caught, and understand how these things happen. Now, the value of these things is that when somebody like Daniel Sheehan files a suit for the Christic Institute where he names defendants such as Albert Hakim, General Secord, who will be the first witness on Monday, General Singlaub, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, and the Columbia cocaine kings, plus a list of other defendants going back to the Bay of Pigs and the old network of the intelligence community. When a suit is filed charging drug running, assassinations, and work with the National Security Council linked right up to Washington, it's important for these groups or attorneys. Now they can reach a computer, they can get indexes of books, they can get transcripts of tapes. They have a team of researchers, not a large army, but big enough, that have stayed with these matters, not easy to understand, complicated, but rewarding. And I really do think that the idealism that Woodrow Wilson talked about is there, because those people I mentioned, and even myself, would never do it if we didn't have a certain amount of idealism. If we were cynical or gave up or thought it was hopeless, none of this would get done. But the very fact that that gavel is going to bang down, and tomorrow, many of you, we get these broadcasts a week later, 4 years later, 5 years later, you can play them back. It's just as timely. That's why they're numbered and dated. But for those of you listening tonight, when that gavel hits that table, that hopefully is the end of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and all the brahu and all the lies that they've pulled. And also, it will expose the media who have covered them up, because the responsibility for all this truly isn't Ronald Reagan. I have spoke Reaganese with friends for years here in California and elsewhere. He stayed the same. The growing up had to be with the Congress that gave him the $100 million, the extra money for the Contras, that said Grenada was a wonderful experience, that approved of the bombing of Libya, the Congress and the news media that lock, stock, and barrel made the phenomena happen. They have to look at themselves and say, where did we miss the boat? It's never too late to do that, and it's going to force a lot of people to ask themselves the question. And sure enough, the gavel's going to bang. Now, May 17th, 1973, that wasn't too many years ago, is when the beginning of the Watergate hearings began. And there are similarities between Watergate and Contragate. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I remember I was at the apartment of Flo Kennedy in San Francisco when the hearings began, and we were so excited. And I was sure, oh, now we're going to get the real tricky Dicky Nixon and all the sleazy things he did, because Sam Ervin sounded so sincere. Well, Sam Ervin didn't get to the bottom of everything, but it opened doors, and then it opened other Senator Frank Church's committee and Pike's committee, and there were a lot of investigations later, and the doors were open. But the things that Sam Ervin said so eloquently, I just want to share 3 or 4 sentences with you. The opening statements just made a while back. That was only 14 years ago. And Reagan follows in with the same team and thinks that things can be different. This is Sam Ervin, May 17, 1973. Today, the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities begins hearings to the extent in which illegal, improper, and unethical activities were involved in the 1972 presidential campaign. Now, these hearings should absolutely involve the 1980 and 1984 presidential campaign of Ronald Reagan. He stole the election both times, and then Fritz Channell was funding members of Congress to pour the money in to influence voters to control the Congress, so Reagan would have 4 years free with his kind of people voting and approving of what he wants. But being caught in Iran, saying the weapons to Iran, and then with Eugene Hassenfuss landing in Nicaragua and all that ensued, this is complicated enough. But later you will see, in his lifetime or outside of his lifetime, all the chapters and verses of the way he stole the election. There are about 7 major categories regarding that. Sam Ervin said, we begin these hearings today in an atmosphere of utmost gravity. The question has been raised in the wake of the June 17th break-in at the time of Watergate about the undergirding of our democracy. And as I say, you'll find similarities in these words, even though the circumstances by which they got caught was different. If the many allegations made to this date are true, then the burglars who broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at Watergate were in effect breaking into the home of every citizen, and if these allegations proved to be true, they were seeking to steal not jewels or money or other property, of the American citizens, but something much more valuable, their most precious heritage, the right to vote in a free election. And this goes into Spitz Channell influencing the voters also with their multi-million-dollar propaganda. He said since the day of their arrest, there's been a mood of incredulity that prevailed among the populace, and it is the constitutional duty of that committee then as now to expeditiously allay those fears being expressed by the citizens and to establish the factual basis upon which the fears were founded. And as Sam Ervin said, we will be concerned with the integrity of a governmental system designed by men who understood the lessons of the past and who accordingly established a framework of separated governmental power in order to prevent any one branch of the government from becoming dominant over the other. The Founding Fathers have participated in the struggle against arbitrary power, comprehended some eternal truth respecting men in government. They knew that those who are entrusted with power are susceptible to the disease of tyrants, which George Washington described as love of power and the proneness to abuse it. For that reason, they realized, as well as other people, that they're obligated to obey, a truth enunciated by Daniel Webster when he said, "Whatever government is not a government of laws is a despotism, let it be called what it may." To the end of ensuring a society governed by laws embodied in the Constitution, they went back to the way the Constitution was written with the executive, legislative, and judicial to check the balances of power. And in dealing with the challenges posed by the multitudinous allegations coming out of Watergate, the Select Committee has a task more difficult or more complex than dealing with the intrusion of any one single form of government. And he says if the allegations made in the wake of it are substantiated, there has been a serious subversion of the integrity of the electoral process, and the committee will be obliged to consider the manner in which the subversion affects the continued existence of this nation. Now, in this case of Watergate, Richard Nixon was stealing the election, which he stole, as Ronald Reagan did in 1980-84. In the Contra fanfare, Reagan bypassed the elected Congress and took the executive to make the powers of war, of deciding who dies, who lives, and using agencies of the government as his own private army, making them swear to secrecy and so forth. So the Congress, one of those three checks and balances, has no purpose at all, and the judiciary sided with him, Edwin Meese, his best friend, so that there was no judiciary, there was just the executive getting away with all this crap. And Sam Ervin said that the aim of their committee was to provide full and open public testimony in order that the nation could proceed with the healing of the wounds that now affect the body politic. The nation and history itself are watching us. We cannot fail this mission. Now that sounded great, but they failed the mission because they covered up so much. The system, and this is very important, the system is made to protect itself. You have to understand the game plans by which the system works. Don't have any illusions when the hearings start. The game plans are as objective and clear, except for a few differences, whether you're playing chess or checkers or backgammon. The players make certain moves in certain directions, and they can't go other directions. The system of control in Washington, particularly in Washington with the intelligence community and the CIA and National Security Council, protects itself. The very first agency protected when all this came down was the National Security Council, with John Tower and Brent Scowcroft, formerly of the National Security Council, saying it's a wonderful institution. We had a few bad apples, but it's wonderful. Go with it, and it has to be cleaned out. Just as Woodrow Wilson said in his last speech before he died that there would be another war against Germany, I can tell you now that there will be other scandals in Washington identical to this because they have protected the NSC, and the NSC is where they should go. So given all the other scapegoats who they can kill or do lobotomies or offer prize money or contracts or movies and books, you're still going to see a lot of funny faces in front of the camera, and it's going to be certainly very, very interesting. But don't have any illusions that the NSC got scraped. The NSC can do just about anything it wants, but on the other hand, there will be an alert Congress, I hope a good group voted in every time we have an election, and an alert group recognizing that their decision-making was wiped out and that they're going to protect it this next time. I'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to the Iran-Contra story and give an overview of some of the characters involved. And then, of course, next week we can get back to the details of them and their agencies and how they operate, and simultaneously how they cover up and try to hold the line, giving just as little as they can, but letting some out, because the hearings will let an awful lot out. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second half of World Watchers, program number 804, and I want to continue with some of the high drama important parts of the Iran-Contra affair, which are so massive, it's just impossible to even scratch most of it within an hour, even doing 1 hour a week. As I say, it'll be going on for many, many years, and many books written about the matter. Identical to Watergate scandal, where Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were both involved, a team of real fascist monsters, we have George Bush as our vice president, and he is not safe or home free so far. I'll see how the hearings go, but as former director of the CIA, and with no CIA members, or formerly called, but no current CIA members before the committee, he may have that kind of protection, but we'll wait and see. When you hear the name George Bush, you've been reading a lot about his pal, Mr. Gomez, whose real name is Felix Rodriguez, from El Salvador. And Gomez Rodriguez, as I've said many times, is the man who helped Klaus Barbie and the Bolivian death squads kill Che Guevara, and the connections to the fascist network of Licio Gelli, the P2. The Vatican comes directly from the context that George Bush had as CIA director, and with Klaus Barbie, among other places, he had a lot of connections, but in particular in Bolivia, with the actions that went on during those years when the cocaine kings were killing and carrying on a real nightmare in that country. There are a lot of articles about George Bush, one from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch titled, Bush Denies Link to Contra Supply Plane, which right away he did, and it's becoming more apparent that he isn't separated from it. A current one, North hired ex-CIA agent for Contra supply missions, and this just came out this past week. Of course, it's been dribbling out all along. Mr. Max Gomez, otherwise known as Rodriguez, working and strongly recommended for work with Oliver North and the group in El Salvador, from Donald Gregg, GREGG, National Security Advisor, to George Bush and a former CIA official. I don't know how we can get closer to Bush and not pull him in, but it'll be interesting to see how he skirts around this. Another article in the LA Times last week, role by Bush doubted in recruiting airlift figure. North did it, the sources say. Well, we have to see whether North did it or not. Mr. Rodriguez was a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He worked with the CIA in Southeast Asia, and then he was in El Salvador, setting up the air flights for the Contras, with a direct link to the offices of Vice President of the United States. Adnan Khashoggi had an article a month ago in the Washington Times. He accused George Bush of funding $1,000 check to the Contras, according to Mr. Khashoggi. Well, that's sort of a teaser to give you an idea what's going to come down. 1,000 is peanuts to these people. And Khashoggi was described as the world's richest man. To say that the Vice President of the United States just gave $5,000 is so ridiculous, but yet it puts his name in the news and is mentioned by one of the top people involved in this whole scandal, and he's fingering Bush. Another article from the Washington Post last week, a long one, Bush is mystery man of Iran affair. Little is known of his role during Reagan's gravest crisis. Now, just sit back and think of the high drama of the former CIA director sitting back while all his former agents that he worked with when he was CIA director are heavily involved in this. And you know that he isn't just sitting back. The question is, how far will the investigators go to get rid of George Bush before they get rid of Ronald Reagan? Now, there are many areas that I've been trying to expose these last 4 or 5 years on World Watchers, week after week, and they come into play right now, and it's very timely that I was right on top of these stories. With the exception of Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger scandal, the others are in the news at the present time. The first is Western Goals that I've talked about with Larry McDonald and their computers into the police departments, and John Singlaub on the board of Western Goals. So it's no coincidence that the very first person to plead guilty to the Iran-Contra affair is Carl Spitz Channell, who took over Western Goals after Larry McDonald went down in the KAL, the Korean airline. He pleaded guilty to get about 13 charges dropped, but I also think they intended never to let him on the stand to protect the possible exposure of what his organizations do, his direct work with Singlaub, who's silently absent in the news stories, what role he's going to take when he gets up there or if he'll be called to testify. And it also protects the National Security Council and Ollie North, who I understand helped write the response of the administration to the downing of the Korean airline when Larry McDonald was killed and when his friend Ollie North took over the agency. I was going to do a broadcast, and I am going to, on Carl Spitz Channell's operation. I thought I'd have a lot of time when the hearing started, and lo and behold, he pleads guilty. But that doesn't mean, within a very short time, I will be getting into a lot of that organization. But I've done, at least 20 or 30 broadcasts on Western Goals, and interestingly enough, it went to Carl Spitz Channell, who is the first person to say, I'm guilty, don't put all that evidence against me, I plead guilty to all of that, or one charge. And so as you saw the headlines this past week, April 30th, Channell pleaded guilty, but he also said Oliver North was in on the deal, and he may go to jail, he may pay a fine. I'm sure he knows too much, particularly about the Korean airline, to get a hard sentence. Also, remember that Albert Hakim's papers about the use of the Korean airline to send weapons to Iran were taken out of his office in Los Gatos, and not much was said about that, and that just may possibly be the pilot from that Korean airline who went down with Larry McDonald. That remains to be seen. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Another area that I worked a lot with, and over the years since I got the Torbet document in 1970, was the Permadex Corporation, formed in Rome for the purpose of political assassinations and military coups, which is what this group of Iran-Contra managers are about, although it appears that the big scandal is the transferring of money or arming the Contras. This is their main purpose. And I've traced these banks, so it's no coincidence that one of the big banks in this whole scandal is Credit Suisse in Switzerland, the secret funding of these operations of Ollie North and Spitz Channell. And this Credit Suisse goes back to early days when Permadex was set up and became part of the Boston Bank, William Weld family. And Boston Bank merged with Merrill Lynch, so that Merrill Lynch has part of the Credit Suisse in Switzerland, and the head of Merrill Lynch, Mr. Don Reagan, became chief of staff for the President of the United States, and their banks are tangled, as well as E.F. Hutton, in drug money, conspiracy money, but Credit Suisse is one of the big ones. There's an article last week, April 26, Pentagon account linked to Contra aid. And so the Defense Department put money into the bank of Ollie North and that gang that went directly to the Contras. The news report says the account was Credit Suisse Bank in Switzerland, where it was tapped for $75,000, just one of those affairs, and sent Polish weapons down on a ship from Denmark, but they used Credit Suisse Bank. Another article in the San Francisco Examiner, probers tracked $10 million in secret funds, and this money went into Credit Suisse. Hakim told congressional investigators $78 million in the Iran's armed money is still in the several Swiss bank accounts. And, of course, there is a long discussion in this particular article that I want to detail later about the money into Credit Suisse that came from the National Security Council. And then there were other articles this week, one from the Wall Street Journal. Contras got $32 million from donors in 9 months. Credit Suisse, the same Swiss bank that figured in the U.S. weapons sales to Iran last year, was a conduit to General Secord's network, that's the TCI, and Credit Suisse is central to the investigations on the diversion of funds. I first became aware of Credit Suisse after Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw, and in the book The Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Lemond, he refers to the network of Permadex operation and their Credit Suisse in Rome that I mentioned before as one of the banks that was set up for controlling the espionage operations that included assassinations and coups. And of course, the board member of Credit Suisse, of Permandex, the organization that used Credit Suisse, is Clay Shaw. And Paris Lamont indicated in his book, and I have a copy of Clay Shaw's notebook with the address of Principessa Marcella Borghese, who's related to Prince Valerio Borghese, known as the Black Prince. And this particular Borghese was anti-British, anti-American, neo-fascist. Fascist is the close link to Stefano Delle Chiaie, the P2, Licio Gelli, and the current administration. So the banking connections that are going to be coming out go directly back to the operations of Permandex and the coup in this country in 1963 that used those same bank accounts. Now, that book that I cited last week, just because the title was so interesting, Hot Money and the Politics of Debt, What Links the Mafia, the Vatican, Moonies, CIA, and Cocaine Barons, and it has to do with flight capital, written by R.T. Naylor, published by Simon & Schuster this year. Interestingly enough, after the introduction, the very first chapter, page 1 and 2, well, it's 19 and 20 because of the introduction, goes directly into the accounts that are used by Ollie North and Spitz Channell for the weapons to Iran, for the weapons, of course, to Angola, to Afghanistan, down to the Contras. And the book just begins this way, a couple sentences. When Bernie Cornfeld, remember he was the lover where Vicki Morgan stayed for a while she was still going out with Alfred Bloomingdale. She couldn't stay at his home. He was married. She stayed with Bernie Cornfeld from the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisor, remember? Okay, when Bernie Cornfeld, the architect of the world's largest and most successful offshore mutual fund, bought his first airplane, the joke around the investors' overseas services was that he was to start a Capital Flight Airlines. If Bernie Cornfeld didn't invent the modern technology of capital flight, that means taking money out of particular countries, emptying it out, he did far more than most of his contemporaries to put it to work. He provided facilities for money to flee the scrutiny and consequently the grasp of particular political authority, which may be the world's second oldest profession. With the capability of flight capital to threaten the stability of the international monetary system, it's much more recent and important. It started after the aftermath of World War II. After the war, the major powers tried to restore their freedom with financial movements going where they wanted, but the book goes on, the very first chapter, by the 1970s, that's when Richard Nixon was well into power, a sophisticated network of financial institutions specialized in channeling funds of places of refuge and of convenience, with a trail lost to the prying eye of the authorities by a maze of shell companies, bank companies, and other paraphernalia of modern peekaboo finance. Some of the fleeing Iranian royalists had been denied access to the more orthodox channels to which the royal family was no stranger. However, the use of heroin as an instrument of capital flight did point back to the days when the kingpins of American organized crime played this very same game. Now, this book goes into Meyer Lansky, the sentimental favorite for all of this, how he worked with Lucky Luciano, who was in Navy intelligence, how they set up their Swiss banking forays, and interestingly enough, I didn't realize that Lansky worked with Huey Long in New Orleans, and they worked with banks in Geneva and Liechtenstein and set up their exchange money. The IOR, that's Bernie Cornfeld, and then Robert Vesco's organization, knew the flight capital business. They worked from Italy and Switzerland and various countries and arranged illegal sales and cash flowing from one country to the other. After establishing its close relationship with T-Bird Rosenbaum's Banque de Crédit International in Geneva, the IOS operated through banks in Chiasso, a little town outside of Geneva. In Chiasso, the main partner of IOS was Finter Bank, long active in flight capital, the subject of a 1960 scandal. Finter Bank fell into the financial orbit of Carlo Pezzenti in 1967, one of the deans of Italian Catholic finance, who teamed up with Cornfeld to revive the flight capital business. One interested party in their company was Ernest Krummeyer, the manager of Chiasso's branch of Credit Suisse, who built their institutions into profitable arms, and the Swiss banks no longer had to rely on Italian banks, but Credit Suisse was a guarantee to depositors to channel money into Liechtenstein and elsewhere. So the connection of Alfred Bloomingdale to Cornfeld to Credit Suisse, to the Contra Iran affair to Credit Suisse, and to the whole team involved in these operations of the transfer of weapons and money going back and forth to lots of countries is going to be an interesting story to see how the committees unfold this, because whatever they bring up, it's going to open up more doors. Now, in addition to my working for years on Western goals that became Carl Spitz Channell's operation, and in addition to his pleading guilty, the first witness to plead guilty, the very first witness, and maybe you'll get the tapes a week later, you will have seen General Richard Secord. Since November of 81, I have been trying to divulge the connections of Edwin Wilson, Frank Churchill, to Stanford Technology, to Helene von Damm, the president's ambassador to Vienna, who made his appointments when he was governor in California, and for his first term, and after the second re-election, she helped with the appointments before she went to Vienna. And I've tried to illustrate through the years Stanford Technology, how it grew out of Otto von Bolschwing's TCI, Trans-International Computer. The subsidiary was International Imaging System, which Albert Hakim took over. Albert Hakim took it, but the network was there. And this same group of Stanford Technology, IIS, and these characters go back to the Nugan Hand Bank, to the shooting of the Pope, Theodore Shackley and Frank Churchill from TCI, to the Allende murder, Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins down in Chile, getting off with the Allende murder, putting Pinochet in power. It was out of this area of Otto von Bolschwing, who headed the Galen organization when Galen went back to Europe, that this network is set up. So when you see Lake Resources, when you see the banking, when you see in these hearings the name Secord, Hakim, Kleins, Wilson, or Shackley, or Singlau. Singlau wasn't part of TCI. He joined through Western Goals and the World Anti-Communist League. He had his own branch of operation, and then they connect. But TCI, Trans-International Computer Investment, set up by the Getty family, the Getty Oil, the Fairchild officers and executives, the Philco Ford, the Schlumbergers, the Defense Department. TCI had a subsidiary. It had two, but one was IIS, and that's where Hakim comes in and takes over. So you'll be hearing a lot of that in the news. And the reason I repeat it now, I've done many broadcasts on it. The reason I'm repeating it now is that the hearings start this week. The first person to plead guilty came out of Western Goals, that manages Western Goals now, and they're not telling you the truth of who's on the board and the board connection of those people to the highest levels of government. They're not telling the truth because it's not going to come out that way. It's up to investigators to use that information to understand Carl Spitz Channel and the operations. But I've been dwelling at length about that Stanford Technology out here in Los Gatos, and then they have subsidiaries in Vienna, Virginia, and so forth. And I've been talking at great length about the scandals in Los Angeles of Western Goals and the LAPD. So Mr. Channell, as I say, pleads guilty. He's the first one. And the first witness is Secord. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it came in that order. I think my research is accurate. I know it is. And right now, these characters that are going to testify across that stage are people that have been linked to the organizations that I've been talking on the air about for the past 16 years. Imagine these people using the banking connections, Lake Resources, and also Robert Vesco and Bernie Cornfeld's account, Mr. Willard Zucker, over there in Switzerland. You're going to see those names over and over again in these hearings until you become familiar with them. And if you're good listeners to World Watchers, you are already. But the Lake Resources and the Compagnie de Services Fiduciaires in Switzerland, the CSF in Geneva, the affiliate of Stanford Technology. These banks, run by Willard Zucker, are part of the early investment overseas and the Vesco connections that were set up offshore after World War II for the purposes of moving large hunks of money, mafia money, and also for the purposes of wiping out people in particular countries that they didn't want in power or didn't want to have heard. So the very first witness will be and has been, by the time you get this later, is Secord. Now, which people worked with Stanford Technology? You take these characters who are put together in various articles, many linked to the Bay of Pigs, most of the Indochina connections, most of them to Iranian connections, most of them to Egypt when Sadat was murdered and Mubarak came into power, a few working with Saudi Arabia, all of them in Nicaragua now and Iran in the latest scandal. And out of TCI comes Richard Secord, Thomas Klein, Theodore Shackley, Oliver North using their banking connections, Albert Hakim, who connected the IIS to TCI, Felix Rodriguez, the guy that works with George Bush, Eric von Marburg, the associate of the current National Security Council advisor, Frank Carlucci, who Marburg was really over him. He lives in Europe now. Edwin Wilson, and the whole team of Michael Ledeen and Robert Brown and Chichi Quintero and all of them used the banking network. William Cooper, who died on the CIA airline, Eugene Hassenfuss, who went down. In Nicaragua, they all used the banking network set out here by the original Galen von Bolschwing network that was put into place for them. A small newsletter called Washington Watch that is sent to me by a listener to World Watchers had an article not too long ago in March, 3 weeks ago, Pieces to the Puzzle. Committee report identifies the key figures. And of course there's Secord and there's Hakim, and again it's the IIS that became the TCI. Then there's a longer article in Washington Watch, The Contra War Returns to Washington. This was February the 18th, going into the connections of the CIA to these particular agencies. And then the article is about the privatization of the ex-CIA and ex-military, and this is the crux of the whole Iran-Contra scandal. And the article says, this is Council on Hemispheric Affairs, February 18th. Contras Incorporated, retired military and intelligence officers behind the pseudo-enterprises. This is the fifth in a series of columns examining the often Stygian network of privatized operations which the Reagan administration has nurtured and relied upon to further its controversial policy. And in this case, Central America, but of course all over the world. This particular section from Washington Report on the Hemisphere is about TCI, the home front connections, and they referred to it as a privatized operation, a home front connection, retired military, retired intelligence, and that's exactly the point. TCI was the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the contractors for aerospace, satellites, Star Wars, and so forth. But under that, they built Stanford Technology and sent these guys all over the world doing their dirty jobs. They have an address here at 8615 Westwood Drive in Vienna, Virginia, and it's about Albert Hakim and the U.S. Air Force and Edwin Wilson and Robert C. Dutton, a retired Air Force colonel who worked at the Pentagon and then worked for Stanford Technology. And the article from the Washington Report on the Hemisphere goes on. They diverted funds, Secord's money, went into Switzerland to the Compagnie de Services Fiduciaires, which in fact it did, and it went to pay the former CIA and former Defense Department out of Stanford Technology, and then the story goes into the Panamanian fronts. And the point of my mentioning this to you again at this particular time is that the areas I was hitting, the von Bolschwing operation, that I still have, I made the corporation papers for, that TCI that became IIS, and then Hakim and Secord and this gang moved into it, is very basic to the entire saga that's coming undone, and Western Goals is the other part of that. Now, if I have been right on fingering the right people for so many years, as I say, the one question that's left is Fritz Kramer, the man running the Pentagon National Security Council, was he Hitler's top general? And as Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger distanced themselves from the president, we get another similarity to Watergate. And I'll hopefully do many broadcasts on how they brought this down, how they stand aside, so we don't glorify that Bush and Reagan are in the hot seat now, because just like an empty stage waiting to come on are Alexander Haig, who's announced he wants to be president, Henry Kissinger, who would love the Constitution changed so he could be president, and General Brent Scowcroft, who assists protecting the National Security Agency so they can do their jobs, and Henry Kissinger floating all over the world representing our State Department. Incidentally, even some establishment magazine like Newsweek has a picture of Credit Suisse in their last issue, May the 4th, hot on the money trail, and there is the building of Credit Suisse, and for so many years I have studied Credit Suisse in Geneva, and there's the face of Albert Hakim and Senator Inouye and so forth, and now the Swiss bank accounts go right back to where they should be, the same people that funded Permindex and these people work with the operators of Permindex. This team were part of not only the Bay of Pigs or the Vietnam experience, but many of them were directly associated with people who murdered John Kennedy, and all of them knew what happened. They weren't called to cover it up, but all of them as operators have been a team for a long, long time. Now, regarding Ronald Reagan and the Contragate hearings, all of you know who listen to World Watchers, or some new listeners know that I'm not new to Ronald Reagan, and just as I mentioned those other people earlier, like Don Freed and Peter Dale Scott or Jonathan Marshall, we're not new to Ronald Reagan, and as I said, he's been the same. He just forces some people to take off their glasses and look at him. I was never fooled by him. Luckily, I didn't have that kind of mind or desire for what he offered the 49 states that voted for him, and I am not only proud but happy to know that I have the intelligence or ability to know the difference and to share with you what I saw. And I think those of you that are loyal listeners to World Watchers or new listeners can appreciate as things unfold what I was trying to tell you, and now get a better view for yourself of things that maybe you didn't even think about or want to entertain. Now, there are a lot of articles about Reagan. This last Saturday there was one in the LA Times. President is aware of Contra funds, and they were quoting various senators and Daniel Inouye, who said he knows a lot. New York Times had a story March 2nd. Memo raises questions on Reagan's knowledge. Earth repeatedly urged that the president be briefed. And as I say, the story of James Michener, you can call the 80s the ugly decade, but Michener is one of those that is responsible for the ugliness. See, all these Johnny-come-latelys can write what they want now because, when the feces hits the fan, you can't help but see it and smell it, so there's nothing to do but clean the thing up, and by cleaning it, you absolve your own conscience by telling people, look what's happening. But one of the worst all along was James Michener, and so he now is analyzing the era, and many of them will too. The People's World had a long story, Irangate, a failed strategy in the Reagan Doctrine by Tim Wheeler. He usually writes good articles, but wasn't a failed strategy. It was a failed lifetime. The man has been a disaster. Imagining where he was, what he fought, what he did, and his whole past will be unfolded like a kaleidoscope. You'll see it all for years and years to come. The Washington Post had a story, clandestine group achieved Reagan goal. With the help of U.S. officials, shoestring operation kept Contra aid flowing. Now, that was written in December, 2 months after Hassenfuss landed. Now we learn that the Sultan of Brunei gave him $14 million. Saudi Arabia gave him $30 or $40 million. Mr. Khashoggi gave them $10 or more million. They got a profit on weapons that were sold. The Spitz Channel gave $34 million. Start adding it all up. This never was a shoestring operation. And these writers who think they're so smart write these articles as if the Contras just managed to get by until Congress gave a little more money. None of that is true. Now, for the next few minutes, there's not too many left for this particular program, but I just want to share with you in chronological order some of the material I had on World Watchers starting January the 4th, 1981, about Ronald Reagan. I put a few of the sheets in chronological order to show you that 7 years ago, I wasn't missing the boat about him or anything about him. January the 4th, 81, I was talking about Jonestown, Angola, and the CIA operations and the use of Philip Blakey in Angola, and then he went on to Jonestown, and he was an active agent who's still alive. That was 1981. In 1987, a lot of this money, I understand, was diverted to Angola, and Reagan is determined to overthrow the government in Angola. This same broadcast, Robert Vesco, the heat is on. Will he leave the Bahamas? He's linked to death, to murders, to drugs, to the drugging of rock musicians, to Ronald Reagan, to the CIA, to narcotics traffic, to Frank Churchill, and Libya. Will he be killed soon? No, he wasn't killed. He's protected by Fidel Castro in Cuba, one of the big mysteries of this whole story. Frank Churchill of STANFORD Technology. Ronald Reagan was to be president in 2 weeks. Robert Vesco's attorney, Willard Zucker, is the banker for the Oliver North Spitz Channel money, and the investigator for the select committee, one of them is Arthur Lyman, is the attorney for Robert Vesco also. Vesco has been part of this administration of the cover-up, the banking money. That was 2 weeks before Reagan took oath of office. He had been elected. Then I had material ex Mooney at Heritage Foundation advising Ronald Reagan to unleash the CIA, bring back the Internal Security Committee, to use food as a weapon, to increase defense spending and combat minorities. Michael Warder, 34, formerly with the Moonies from 1969 to 1981, went to the top of the rank and was advising the president how to unleash the CIA, and that is part of the problem, casing the CIA, using them for arms and Contras or anything they wanted. That was part of the problem. And the very same broadcast I was talking about, the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and the effect it would have on this country. Well, I don't even have time to go into year one. I may write a book, think about writing a book on things I had on the air 7 years ago about Ronald Reagan and what happened 7 years later, just in terms of the Iran-Contra affair. Give it a 7-year span, what was happening then and what's happening now, just to illustrate that these events in front of our lives are not new, they're not secret, they're open, they're only what you want to accept, what you want to believe. You can have the ideals that Woodrow Wilson talked about, but you have to recognize people who don't have ideals. This is Mae Brussell, and my time is out. I'll be back with you next week in World Watchers to talk some more, and for many years, about the Iran-Contra affair.